NAL, an opticien of the Avan spacefaring people who lived on various planets in the Subar sector, was struggling to raise the Olympic bar onto its resting hooks with the help of his Avan-scaled arms, which were trembling under the weight. "I want one more rep," the human said in a professional tone, hovering over N with her usual grim face. "If you can't manage this, you can't manage our gravity," the human said, tapping his pin on the clipboard he held. Their technological advancements were so advanced that many opticien had never seen grass. This was partly because they turned their plants into hab units, eliminating the need for farming or agriculture. They traded parks machines, chips, and other such goods for high credit values, so they could easily buy food. The lack of resources was also exacerbated by the small and not very dense planets, which caused light gravity and very little space for agrarian activities. They were invited to Earth because of their advanced technology, which propelled them into space at a dizzying pace and allowed them to begin harvesting nearby asteroids for their dense materials. It had been a close call, but they narrowly avoided the collapse and extinction of their own society. Now they were an industrial powerhouse, making the best engines in space and experts at harvesting asteroids. Given that the insectoid Dimir was defeated by humans, many planets owed them a favor and found it annoying to have little iron monkeys scuttling around on their ships during the war. This was mostly because humans couldn't make their own ships, and they were already supported by opticians harvesting resources for them. It was humans who prevented the Dimir from destroying and consuming opticien. The Avan owed the humans a great debt, but the opticien found humans physically uninteresting and felt superior. The opticien possessed scales on their limbs and arms, short claws on their feet, a feathered tail, and 2 thumbs on their clawed hands. Their eyes were huge and multicolored, and their hair resembled fine feathers that cascaded down their necks. Their skin was similar to humans, but it had markings around the outside of their thighs and calves were covered in finer feathers, and their faces were elongated around the nose, like a relic from their ancestors. The humans, on the other hand, had all the strength and muscle of their planet, but the opticien were a small, weak-willed people who preferred to hire mercenaries to fight for them. The opticien were certain that humans were simply artificially enhanced with chemicals to make them so strong. It wasn't until they were invited to Earth that the opticien realized how weak they really were. A ship had crashed on its descent to the surface, and the pilots struggled to control the craft, and, despite their dampeners, most of them blacked out. Prior to this, they hadn't even considered the possibility that they were too weak to withstand the gravity of the planet, unlike other spacefaring people. The ships had already landed and were circling the lush planet. Investigations revealed that the pilots had been arrogant and had turned off the warnings that had been pinging across their flight panels. The disaster was catastrophic, but the ships transporting the real engineers and dignitaries were able to punch back into space in time, preventing an even worse tragedy. This left the optician ships in space, but they swiftly devised a solution using their extremely advanced technology. The opticien glowed and fluttered in the shock of the humans as they hurried back to their home world of Subar True to construct a portable space station. They then brought it back to Earth in record time, further increasing the opticien's positive reception. After all, what else could this species do if they could put a complete space station into orbit in such a short amount of time? The opticien's frailty was a major issue. They had been gradually weakened by space and their planet's weak gravity for centuries, without ever thinking to use their artificial gravity machines to fortify themselves. Humans found this weakness repulsive and questioned whether the Avan species could sustain itself. Other species, such as the Ural and Pa, were already struggling, but at least they had some muscle and could withstand Earth's gravity while the station was in orbit around Earth, it was anchored in place by complex atmospheric engines. The humans then set out to toughen up the Opticin. They introduced the Avan aliens to something they had never seen before, and the Opticin initially thought they were being tortured. The humans set up a modest gym on the station, using equipment provided by the Opticin. Personal trainers began to get these bird people in shape, but there was an obvious problem. Their initial focus was on strengthening their legs and core, but after a few weeks they shifted their focus to arms. The Opticin weren't ready for the insane amount of arm exercises that humans knew, so they threw everything from barbells to kettlebells and worked them through a rotation of exercises. Another issue was that humans couldn't adjust to the low gravity. One trainer accidentally launched a cable into the gym's roof decking, which is still there. The station had to be divided into two parts with There were two gravity settings, one for humans to relax in and another for Opticin to toughen up and survive. Eventually, humans started wearing shoes with a slight magnet under the wood decking to prevent them from losing their footing in the low gravity. One of the exercisers was a gold plume engineer, a high-ranking member of his species, and his mottled green feathers grew faster as he worked through hammer curls, alternate cross curls, preacher, and other movements. Curls, chest flies, reverse curls, front raises, and the sheer number of arm muscles these humans possessed were all on display today during a workout called a bench press. Anne, who had become fluent in English in a matter of days, thought the exercise should have been named the guillotine instead. His human instructor, a Frenchman, couldn't help but laugh at his antics. With a tap on the bar, the machine made light ringing noises. Anne, who was clearly struggling, struggled mightily, pushing with all his might, finally locked out his. With a gasp, he let out a short cry. "There you go," the human said, easing back on the bar with one hand and asking, "How are we feeling?" Opticin's chest was heaving, sweat was pouring down his skin and feathers, and the human chuckled. He extended a helping hand and lifted him up with ease. His name was Stephen, which was a hard name to pronounce because he kept saying Stephen, but he was kind. Stephen chuckled as he muttered under his breath and made his way towards the landmine bar in the large gym. It seemed like the other humans were much more strict and intense, so he must have had Lou out. "Let's do another set of lumberjack squats. These will work your legs and arms." He pointed to the bar, which was in the corner. Almost everyone else was working out, except for 200 people who were either sleeping, eating, or lying face down on massage tables, crying, and putting on a brave face. "Okay, we're ready to begin." We are doing the lumberjack, and he thought he had mastered it. However, he and the other Opticin were having trouble speaking in unison, which the humans found endearing. They weren't even trying to change it. In fact, they were demanding that they maintain it. As he assumed his position on the planet, his feet clicked along the wooden floor, which the Opticin preferred because their planets no longer had any real trees. He had to hold the bar on his chest with his palms under it, which was already causing his arm feathers to tremble. After a few heartbeats, he squatted down and held the position for a few more. Then, he stood back up, his leg muscles screaming from the effort. He managed to do 20 reps before Stephen lunged forward, taking the bar in one hand and catching it in the other. "Dude, you can't go that hard yet," he said under his breath. After his workout, he went to his favorite spot. He gazed out the station's large glass window, taking in the verdant landscape below. A smile spread across his face as he whispered to himself, his heart longing for the grass he had never felt before. In his imagination, he could run through the prairies and meadows he had only seen in books and on video, swim through clean, fresh water, and relax under a shade tree in the warm sun. With a heavy heart, he sat down in a chair, his chin resting on his clawed fingers, and fantasized about his next move. Listening to a voice behind him, N turned to Joseph, another human on board, but not a trainer. Joseph leaned in, crossed his legs, and took a seat next to N on the rad. Looking down, he could see the deep woods of the Appalachians, the mountain meadows of Colorado, the desert shrub of New Mexico, and countless other places. Down below, he could also visit Europe, walk along the high-altitude grasslands of Switzerland, land on the tundras of Russia, or simply splash around in the ocean for a while. Joseph pointed to the planet in the general area where these locations are located, and he looked down at South America, saying, "Wonderful," leaning forward in the nest. "What is it like to be inside that landmass?" Nal mumbled something about the jungle, and Joseph pulled out his phone to start scrolling through pictures of the Amazon. "We nearly lost this place, you know. You guys saved the day by supplying us with resources during the war, and now we're able to stop harvesting our planet altogether. Thanks to your gene regeneration technology, we were even able to reintroduce some extinct species." At one point, Joseph was worried that the jungle would disappear, but now it's doing better than ever. "We owe you a lot, and we were about to start blaming you when he made that statement." Lei felt a sense of pride in his people's efforts to preserve this small piece of the planet before you arrived. There were some of the strongest soldiers he had ever seen fighting there. "As for me, I'd want to go to Crested, but especially during the wildflower season. It has always been my favorite memory of that time of year." I managed to control my excitement and jump to my feet, but I was sore afterward. "Yes, there are shade trees and a beautiful view of the mountains." After staring out the window for 10 minutes, he finally asked, "So, how close am I to being ready if you pass the gravity test and remember to take your calcium pills for 2 weeks?" Joseph checked his data slate and grimaced. He despised the taste of the calcium pills, which were designed to help him avoid chum. In order to improve and fortify the opticin's Adamite bone mass, he nodded and then pumped his fist in the air. He then turned to face Joseph, who said with a broad smile, "I'll let Steven know when I finish it." The only thing keeping Laylee motivated was the thought of walking through the grass while he pushed through the leg press exercises, squats, curls, extensions, rowing, and those horrifying calcium pills. It was frustrating, to say the least. The Opticin were taken aback by the trainer's display of raw strength, which quickly humbled them. The female Opticin were fascinated by the humans' removal of their shirts to demonstrate the inner workings of their muscles, while a few of the male Opticin avoided looking too closely out of shame. Nevertheless, the Opticin remained focused on their own objectives, and after 2 weeks of training, they were prepared to face the gravity room. On one side of the station, there was artificial gravity that was adjusted to Opticin standards. This allowed them to ease into working out, but on the other side, there was a room where things got dicey. This room could be turned up to Earth's actual gravity, and one cocky Opticin managed to break both of his legs trying to use it. The room also had obstacles within it that were: step over a little wall, crawl under a few poles, run, jog, and jump to specific points marked by colored markers, operate ship controls, and, worst of all, survive 3 Gs of force in a terrifying device that spun on wheels. The aliens had been able to survive for years by installing directional force dampeners on their ships, which made quick space turns easy and reduced the risk of injury to humans, fighter jets, and pilots. 10 Gs were crucial in destroying the Dimir during the in-atmosphere dogfights, but everyone else assumed that human pilots had G-dampening gear. Nobody remembered the gasp that escaped when the Opticin and everyone else found out that humans could tank raw Gs in just a flight suit. This news caused quite a stir among the Stars N, And someone also remembered the time a PO tried to ride passenger in a jet and almost died during a 7G turn, but the pilot had laughed it off. He stood in line with the other Optician as they were LED in 10 at a time. It didn't take long for his fellow Optician to start emerging from the gravity room on stretchers. Thankfully, no one was breaking bones this time. Instead, they were simply collapsing to the deck in exhaustion after 110 failures. He had to be strong and make the Optician proud. Of course, the humans would refer to this as a damn stick. He recalled a situation where one person had thrown a spoon at another, causing everyone to duck and cover during breakfast. He also noticed that the gravity room had changed and that the control stick test had been moved to the front of the line. As they entered the room, a warning buzzer chimed several times, alerting the Optician that the gravity was about to change. She urged the Optician to remain strong for their people, called out in her own vibratory language, and then let out a harsh exhalation as the gravity struck. N's eyes pounded as he drew himself upright, his aching legs strained against gravity. Someone slid to the ground, wailing, but he turned his head away. N muttered something in English, stepped forward with a sharp exhale, and sat down in the seat surrounded by prairie flowers and shady trees. The simulation began, and N breezed through it, landing the cargo ship with ease. The light turned green, and N sat up, flexing his core muscles as he did so. Finally, he pressed onto the next stage. A 3-pound box lay on the floor. He had to raise it into a green square on the shelf, just like the humans did. He pounded his chest, exhaled, and grunted, then squatted down with perfect form, grabbed the box, his leg and arm muscles bulging as he lifted it. Sweat drenched his skin and feathers. As soon as he stood up, he blinked away the sweat, placed the box on the shelf, and the square lit up green. Finally, he threw the box back down to the floor. I tilted upwards, allowing the box to slide off towards its approximate location before being picked up by someone else. Then, I had to jump over 5 knee-high walls while jogging. I was breathing heavily and quickly wiped the sweat off my face with the sleeve of my workout suit. Regardless, I started forward anyway, hopping over the small walls with heavy clacks on the wooden floor. I grunted as I landed on the decking, but I managed to jump over the 5th wall with only a small stumble. I quickly got back up to my feet. Leaning backwards, exhaling sharply, he began to jog, and by the time he had to run, his feathers were dripping beads of sweat onto the ground. He whispered to himself, "Go, jog, run," as his body struggled to maintain its composure. Stephen had taught N to walk without pausing, swinging his arms. After a good while of walking, he heard a chime ring above him, signaling that it was time to jog. He exhaled hard, began to jog, and by the time he had to run, his feathers were dripping beads of sweat onto the ground. He ran with all his might, swinging his arms and legs as Stephen had instructed. With his eyes closed and his lungs burning, he inhaled the cold air of the space station and let out a loud gasp when the chime came again. At that moment, a voice called out over the intercom, "Gold Plum Engineer L, you have a 5-minute break," and N collapsed to the floor, his chest slamming against the floor. His heart raced as he attempted to catch his breath. Suddenly, a voice chuckled over the intercom. L turned around to see it was Stephen. "What goes down must have come up," he cried out, laughing at his own foolishness. He had to stand up, and then a female Optigan crashed down next to him, her bright purple feathers trembling from the exertion. "Please, take a breather," the voice said over the intercom, "Silver Plum Engineer Captic." Intercom and everyone could hear the sharp beginning of laughter before the mic cut off the thank you. Suddenly, Keptic sobbed, her chest so soaked that one could see the entire shape of her sports bra, a practical item of apparel that all the female opticians wore. A long, painful groan escaped him as he leaned up to speak to her in their native tongue. Nodding, Keptic agreed, saying, "It's worse that we sometimes have to wait for our turn at the tasks. Why do I try to get so far ahead? I'm not sure what's worse. Honestly, I don't know what's worse. Neither of us is quite sure, but 1 minute goes PL engineer, the other minute." Above them, a voice said, "Hey, listen." NAL hobbled to his feet and stomped slightly towards the next obstacle. This was a new test, but he was prepared for it. The water bags were 2-gallon jugs of water and plastic bottles of all things. He had to lift them, press them over his head, and then lower them again. He had to do this 5 times, each time struggling against Earth gravity. By the 5th rep, he was exhausted and had to let go, causing the jug to splash to the ground with hollow. The human stepped out of the doorway, held 2 new jugs of water and a mop in the other. He chuckled and waved the water jugs at the other human, saying, "You're showing off." The human seemed so casual about it, and he thought to himself bitterly as he watched the human's movements. Despite this, the human moved on to the next challenge, which was the crawl-in. As he struggled through the crawling challenge, he managed to keep his tail from getting caught and emerged from the other side just as sweaty as when he had begun. Despite the terror it had inflicted on his chest, his heart raced as he thumped down into the seat, fastening his harness as he breathed up toward the ceiling. Suddenly, he realized he was the first optician to reach this point, and a small dial represented his progress. Underneath a statement that read, "Octomen have arrived to challenge the station," there was a zero-filled dial. Near a door, at the other end of the wall, was another dial that read, "Octomen who have passed in victory welcome to Earth." NAL, who was staring intently at the sign, read it under his breath, and his eyes widened in realization. Finally, a voice sounded from above, and all the other opticians paused. N's vision started to blur as a small screen in front of him read out too as he turned in surprise to see a blurry scene at the far end of the room. The wheeled car shuddered, and he inhaled a breath of beautiful blue and purple flowers. In a panic, he whispered to himself, clinging to the blue sky and sun for warmth and comfort. The wind howled, howling in a shallow voice close to his skull and ears. The sound of rustling in the wind rustled his feathers, and he smelled the scent of rain. As the car accelerated, his vision began to blur. At 2.5 Gs, his body felt like it was going to collapse. Darkness drew in from the corners of his eyes, but he remembered how human fighter pilots dealt with such intense forces, so he tightened his thigh and stomach muscles. As he counted down from 10, he silently shrieked to himself, picturing himself sprinting through a meadow with palms touching the grass. At 3 Gs, the screen read out the countdown, and New York squeezed and released with all his might, closing his eyes and concentrating on not passing out. Nothing could go wrong here. Not long ago, he was on the verge of passing out from the sheer adrenaline coursing through his veins. Just as the car started to slow down, he snapped open his eyes and his jaw dropped. He stared wide-eyed as the car finally stopped, his body trembling from the sheer adrenaline. Suddenly, he heard a soft ding from the wall, and NAL glanced over to see a single person standing on the counter, with the light having turned green. He asked Josephine, the woman holding the door open for him, about it, and she shrugged, saying, "I mean you." Could crawl, but decided walking was better. Leaning out of the all-terrain vehicle, he heard his talon feet clicking on the roadway. After a few more weeks of adjusting to Earth gravity and more tests, he was finally here. He had requested a day off before starting work, and it had been graciously granted. Josephine, a beautiful brown-haired woman, even offered to drive him to this little grassy area of Crescent. He began to cry as he stepped forward, but he finally arrived. He felt his soul float on air as he stepped out into the grass, his hands caressing the flowers. He cried out, falling gently onto his knees and thinking about how humans nearly lost everything to create weapons. He laughed uncontrollably, leaning down to smell the flowers, and wondered if they smelled as sweet as he had imagined. Josephine stood by his side, her hands in her pockets, and she gazed around at the flowers. Looking out over the ocean of swaying green grass, rustling trees, and sweet mountain wind, Nal took a tissue from Josephine's pocket and wiped his eyes as he stood next to her, holding his hands to his face. Meanwhile, at Fort Wood, Missouri, Friend slammed her patrol cap, yelling in frustration as she ripped another tick from her dull yellow fur. Himmel and Zayton rolled the rise nearby. This planet is an absolute pit. How on earth can people live here?